Ulysses S. Grant, born Hiram Ulysses Grant, April 27, 1822 – July 23, 1885, was a prominent United States Army general during the American Civil War and commanding general at the conclusion of that war. He was elected as the 18th President of the United States in 1868, serving from 1869 to 1877. As commanding general, Grant worked closely with President Abraham Lincoln to lead the Union Army to victory over the Confederacy. After Lincoln's assassination, Grant's assignment in implementing Reconstruction often put him at odds with President Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor. Twice elected president, Grant led the Republicans in their effort to remove the vestiges of Confederate nationalism and slavery, protect African American citizenship and civil rights, implement Reconstruction, and support economic prosperity. Grant's presidency has often been criticized for its scandals and for his failure to alleviate the economic depression following the Panic of 1873, but modern scholarship regards him as a president who performed a difficult job during the early post-Civil War era. Grant graduated in 1843 from the United States Military Academy at West Point and served in the Mexican-American War. After the war, he married Julia Dent in 1848, and together they had 4 children. Grant retired from the Army in 1854 and struggled financially in civilian life. When the Civil War began in 1861, he rejoined the U.S. Army and quickly rose through the ranks. In 1862, Grant took control of Kentucky and most of Tennessee, and led Union forces to victory in the Battle of Shiloh, earning a reputation as an aggressive commander. In July 1863, after a series of coordinated battles, Grant defeated Confederate armies and seized Vicksburg, giving the Union control of the Mississippi River and dividing the Confederacy in two. After Grant's victories in the Chattanooga campaign, Lincoln promoted him to lieutenant general and commanding general of the Army in March 1864. Grant confronted Robert E. Lee in a series of bloody battles, trapping Lee's army in their defense of Richmond. Grant coordinated a series of devastating campaigns in other theaters, as well. In April 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox, effectively ending the war. Historians have hailed Grant's military genius, and his strategies are featured in military history textbooks, but a minority contend that he won by brute force rather than superior strategy. With the close of the Civil War, Grant as commanding general led the Army's supervision of Reconstruction in the former Confederate States. Elected president in 1868, he stabilized the nation during that turbulent period, creating the Department of Justice. He briefly used the military to enforce laws in the former Confederate States and prosecuted the Ku Klux Klan while protecting blacks from violent attack. Grant strengthened the Republican Party in the South and signed 3 Civil Rights Acts into law. In 1871, he created the first Civil Service Commission, to appease reformers. The Democrats and Liberal Republicans united behind Grant's opponent in the presidential election of 1872, but Grant was re-elected by a strong margin. In his second term, the Republican coalitions in the South splintered and were defeated as a faction of white Southern redeemers regained control of Southern state governments using violence, voter fraud, and racist appeal. Although personally regarded as honest, members of Grant's administration faced charges of corruption more than any other administration in the 19th century. Grant's peace policy with Native Americans was a bold departure, but historians agree that, as with Reconstruction, it ended in failure. In foreign policy, Grant sought to increase trade and influence while remaining at peace with the world. With Secretary of State Hamilton Fish, he successfully resolved the Alabama claims through the Treaty of Washington with Great Britain. Grant and Fish negotiated a peaceful resolution with Spain over the Virginius affair. Congress rejected Grant's initiative to annex the Dominican Republic, creating a rift among Republicans. His administration implemented a gold standard and sought to strengthen the dollar. Grant's immediate response to the Panic of 1873 failed to halt a severe industrial depression that produced high unemployment, deflation, and bankruptcies. When he left office in 1877, he embarked on a 2.5-year world tour that captured favorable global attention for him and the United States. In 1880, Grant was unsuccessful in obtaining the Republican presidential nomination for a third term. Facing severe investment reversals and dying of throat cancer, he wrote his memoirs, which proved to be a major critical and financial success. His death in 1885 prompted an outpouring in support of national unity. Historical assessments of Grant's legacy have varied considerably over the years. His popular reputation focuses on his drinking, which historians agree did not adversely affect his military campaigns. Early historical evaluations were mostly negative about Grant's presidency. Scholars have ranked his presidency below the average, but modern appreciation for Grant's support of civil rights has helped improve his historical reputation. Early life and education. Hiram Ulysses Grant was born in Point Pleasant, Ohio, on April 27, 1822, to Jessie Root Grant, a tanner and merchant, and Hannah Grant, née Simpson. His ancestors Matthew and Priscilla Grant arrived aboard the Mary and John at Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. Grant's great-grandfather fought in the French and Indian War, and his grandfather, Noah, served in the American Revolution at Bunker Hill. Afterward, Noah settled in Pennsylvania and married Rachel Kelly, the daughter of an Irish pioneer. Their son Jesse, Ulysses's father, was a Whig Party supporter and abolitionist. Jesse Grant moved to Point Pleasant in 1820 and found work as a foreman in a tannery. He soon met his future wife, Hannah, and the two were married on June 24, 1821. 10 months later Hannah gave birth to their first child, a son. At a family gathering several weeks later the boy's name, Ulysses, was drawn from ballots placed in a hat. Wanting to honor his father-in-law, Jesse declared the boy to be Hiram Ulysses, though he would always refer to him as Ulysses. In 1823, the family moved to the village of Georgetown, Ohio, where 5 more siblings were born: Simpson, Clara, Orville, Jenny, and Mary. At the age of 5, young Grant began his formal education, starting at a subscription school and later was enrolled in 2 private schools. In the winter of 1836–1837, Grant was a student at Maysville Seminary, and in the autumn of 1838 he attended John Rankin's Academy. In his youth, Grant developed an unusual ability to ride, work with, and control horses. Expressing a strong dislike for the tannery, Grant's father instead put this ability to use, giving Ulysses work driving wagon loads of supplies and transporting people. Unlike his siblings, Grant was not forced to attend church by his Methodist parents. For the rest of his life, he prayed privately and never officially joined any denomination. To others, including late in life, his own son, Grant appeared to be an agnostic. He inherited some of Hannah's Methodist piety and quiet nature while adopting his father's Whig political inclinations. Early military career and personal life. West Point and first assignment. Grant's father wrote to Representative Thomas L. Hammer requesting that he nominate Ulysses to the United States Military Academy, USMA, at West Point, New York. When a spot opened in March 1839, Hammer nominated the 16-year-old Grant. He mistakenly wrote down Ulysses S. Grant, which became Grant's adopted name. Initially reluctant because of concerns about his academic ability, Grant entered the academy on July 1, 1839, as a cadet and trained there for 4 years. On Sundays, cadets were required to march to and attend services at the academy's church, a requirement that Grant disliked. His nickname became Sam among Army colleagues since the initials US also stood for Uncle Sam. While at the academy, Grant developed a reputation as the most proficient horseman. During the graduation ceremony, while riding York, a large and powerful horse that only Grant could manage well, he set a high jump record that stood for 25 years. His greatest interest was horses. Seeking relief from military routine, he also studied under Romantic artist Robert Walter Weir and produced 9 surviving artworks. He spent more time reading books from the library than his academic texts, frequently reading works by James Fenimore Cooper and others. Initially Grant was indifferent to military life, but within a year he re-examined his desire to leave the academy and later wrote, "On the whole I like this place very much." Quiet by nature, Grant established a few intimate friends among fellow cadets, including Frederick Tracy Dent and James Longstreet. He was inspired both by the Commandant, Captain Charles F. Smith, and by General Winfield Scott, who visited the academy to review the cadets. Grant later wrote of the military life, "There is much to dislike, but more to like." Grant graduated on June 30, 1843, ranked 21st out of 39 alumni, and was promoted on July 1 to the rank brevet second lieutenant. Small for his age at 17, he had entered the academy weighing only 117 pounds at 5 feet 2 inches tall. Upon graduation 4 years later he had grown to a height of 5 feet 7 inches. Glad to leave the academy, he planned to resign his commission after his 4-year term of duty. Grant would later write to a friend that among the happiest days of his life was the day he left the presidency and the day he left the academy. Despite his excellent horsemanship, he was not assigned to the cavalry, but to the 4th Infantry Regiment. He served as regimental quartermaster, managing supplies and equipment. Grant's first assignment took him to the Jefferson Barracks near St. Louis, Missouri. Commanded by Colonel Stephen W. Kearny, the barracks was the nation's largest military base in the West. Grant was happy with his new commander, but looked forward to the end of his military service and a possible teaching career. He spent some of his time in Missouri visiting Dent's family and became engaged to Dent's sister, Julia, in 1844. 4 years later, on August 22, 1848, they were married at Julia's home in St. Louis. Grant's abolitionist father Jesse, who disapproved of the Dents owning slaves, refused to attend their wedding, which took place without either of Grant's parents. Grant was flanked by 3 fellow West Point graduates, all dressed in their blue uniforms, including Longstreet, Julia's cousin. At the end of the month, Julia was nevertheless warmly received by Grant's family in Bethel, Ohio. They had 4 children: Frederick, Ulysses Jr., Buck, Ellen, Nellie, and Jesse. After the wedding, Grant obtained a 2-month extension to his leave and returned to St. Louis when he decided, with a wife to support, that he would remain in the Army. Mexican-American War. After rising tensions with Mexico following the United States annexation of Texas, war broke out in 1846. During the conflict, Grant distinguished himself as a daring and competent soldier. Before the war, President John Taylor had ordered Grant's unit to Louisiana as part of the Army of Observation under Major General Zachary Taylor. In September 1846, Taylor's successor, James K. Polk, unable to provoke Mexico into war at Corpus Christi, Texas, ordered Taylor to march 150 miles south to the Rio Grande. Marching south to Fort Texas, to prevent a Mexican siege, Grant experienced combat for the first time on May 8, 1846, at the Battle of Palo Alto. While serving as regimental quartermaster, Grant yearned for a combat role. When finally allowed, he led a cavalry charge at the Battle of Resaca de la Palma, demonstrating his equestrian ability at Monterrey by carrying a dispatch past snipers while hanging off the side of his horse, keeping the animal between him and the enemy. Before leaving the city, he stopped at a house occupied by wounded Americans, giving them assurance he would send for help. Polk, wary of Taylor's growing popularity, divided his forces, sending some troops, including Grant's unit, to form a new army under Major General Winfield Scott. Traveling by sea, Scott's army landed at Veracruz and advanced toward Mexico City. The army met the Mexican forces at the battles of Molino del Rey and Chapultepec outside Mexico City. For his bravery at Molino del Rey, Grant was brevetted first lieutenant on September 30. At San Cosme, men under Grant's direction dragged a disassembled howitzer into a church steeple, reassembled it, and bombarded nearby Mexican troops. His bravery and initiative earned him his second brevet promotion to captain. On September 14, 1847, Scott's army marched into the city. Mexico ceded the vast territory, including California, to the U.S. on February 2, 1848. During the war, Grant studied the tactics and strategies of Scott and Taylor, later writing in his memoirs that this is how he learned about military leadership. In retrospect, he identified his leadership style with Taylor's. However, Grant also wrote that the Mexican War was wrong and the territorial gains were designed to expand slavery, stating, "I was bitterly opposed to the measure, and to this day, regard the war, which resulted, as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation." He opined that the Civil War was punishment on the nation for its aggression in Mexico. During the war, Grant discovered his moral courage and began to consider a career in the Army. Pacific duty and resignation. Grant's first post-war assignments took him and Julia to Detroit and then to Sackett's Harbor, New York. In 1852, Grant was ordered to the Pacific Northwest, traveling the New York-Panama oceanic route. Julia, 8 months pregnant with Ulysses Jr., did not accompany him. In Panama, an outbreak of cholera among his fellow travelers caused 150 fatalities. Grant arranged makeshift transportation and hospital facilities and helped nurse the sick. In August, Grant arrived in San Francisco, and his next assignment sent him north to Vancouver Barracks in the Oregon Territory, subsequently Washington Territory in March 1853. To supplement a military salary which was inadequate to support his family, Grant speculated and failed at several business ventures, confirming his father's belief that he had no head for business. Grant assured Julia in a letter that local Native Americans were harmless, while he developed an empathy for the plight of Indians from the unjust treatment by white men. Promoted to captain on August 5, 1853, Grant was assigned to command Company F, 4th Infantry, at the newly constructed Fort Humboldt in California. He arrived at the fort on January 5, 1854, and reported to its commander Lieutenant Colonel Robert C. Buchanan. Grant was bored and depressed about being separated from his wife Julia, and he began to drink. An officer who roomed with Grant said he fell too much under the influence of liquor to properly perform his duties. Colonel Buchanan demanded he should resign. Historian Jean Edward Smith says, "The story rings true." When Grant was reprimanded by Buchanan for one drinking episode, Grant told Buchanan if he did not reform he would resign. One Sunday, Grant was rumored to have been found at his company's pay table influenced by drink. Keeping his pledge to Buchanan, Grant resigned, effective July 31, 1854, without explanation. Buchanan endorsed Grant's letter of resignation but did not submit any report that verified the incident. Grant was neither arrested nor faced court-martial, while the War Department stated, "Nothing stands against his good name." Grant said years later, "The vice of intemperance, drunkenness, had not a little to do with my decision to resign." With no means of support, Grant returned to St. Louis and reunited with his family, uncertain about his future. Civilian struggles and politics. At age 32, with no civilian vocation, Grant needed work to support his growing family. It would prove to be the beginning of what would be 7 financially lean years. His father offered him a place in the Galena, Illinois, branch of the family's leather business on condition that Julia and the children stay with her parents in Missouri or with the Grants in Kentucky. Ulysses and Julia opposed another separation and declined the offer. In 1855, Grant farmed on his brother-in-law's property near St. Louis, using slaves owned by Julia's father. The farm was not successful and to earn money he sold firewood on St. Louis street corners. Earning only $50 a month, wearing his faded army jacket, an unkempt Grant desperately looked for work. The next year, the Grants moved to land on Julia's father's farm, and built a home Grant called Hardscrabble. Julia disliked the rustic house, which she described as an unattractive cabin. The Panic of 1857 devastated farmers, including Grant, who, reaching a low ebb financially, pawned his gold watch to pay for Christmas. In 1858, Grant rented out Hardscrabble and moved his family to Julia's father's 850-acre estate, a plantation that employed slave labor. That fall, after a bout of malaria, Grant retired from farming. The same year, Grant acquired a slave from his father-in-law, a 35-year-old man named William Jones. In March 1859, Grant freed William, worth about $1,500, instead of selling him at a time when he needed money. Grant moved to St. Louis, taking on a partnership with Julia's cousin Harry Boggs, working in real estate business as a bill collector, again without success, and at Julia's recommendation dissolved his partnership. In August, Grant applied for a position as county engineer, believing his education qualified him for the job. His application came with 35 notable recommendations, but Grant correctly assumed the position would be given on the basis of political affiliation and was passed over as he was believed to share his father-in-law's Democratic sentiments. In April 1860, Grant and his family moved north to Galena, accepting a position in his father's leather goods business run by his younger brothers Simpson and Orville. In a few months, Ulysses paid off the debts he acquired in Missouri. Ulysses and family attended the local Methodist church and he soon established himself as a reputable citizen of Galena. In the 1856 presidential election, Grant cast his first presidential vote for Democrat James Buchanan, later saying he was really voting against Republican John C. Fremont over concern that his anti-slavery position would lead to Southern secession and war. Although Grant was not an abolitionist, neither was he considered a slavery man, and could not bring himself to force slaves to do work. By the 1860 election, Grant was openly Democratic, favoring Democrat Stephen A. Douglas over Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln over the Southern Democrat, John C. Breckinridge. Lacking the residency requirements in Illinois at the time, he could not vote. After Lincoln was elected, Southern states seceded from the Union, forming a confederacy, seizing federal forts and institutions. Civil War. Early commands. On April 12, 1861, the American Civil War began as Confederate troops attacked Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. Grant wrote to his father in a letter of April 21 that we have a government and laws and a flag, and they must all be sustained. There are but two parties now, traitors and patriots. 2 days after the attack, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers and a mass meeting was held in Galena to assess the crisis and encourage recruitment. Before the attack, Grant had not reacted strongly to Southern secession. The news came as a shock in Galena, and Grant shared his neighbors' concern about the war. The captain of the local militia nominated Grant, the only man in town with professional military training, to lead the recruitment effort. A speech by his father's attorney, John Aaron Rawlins, stirred Grant's patriotism. Rawlins later became Grant's aide-de-camp and close friend during the war. Grant recalled with satisfaction that after that first recruitment meeting in Galena, "I never went into our leather store again." Grant quickly raised and recruited a company of volunteers, and was given the captaincy, accompanying them to Springfield. He perceived that the war would be fought mostly by volunteers, not career soldiers. Governor Richard Yates offered Grant a militia commission to recruit and train volunteer units, which he accepted, but still wanted a field command. He made several efforts through his professional contacts. Major General George B. McClellan refused to see him, remembering the day in Oregon in 1853 when he saw Grant on a drunken spree. With the aid of his advocate, Representative Elihu B. Washburn of Illinois, Grant was promoted to colonel on June 14 and charged with disciplining the unruly 21st Illinois Volunteer Infantry Regiment. Transferred to northern Missouri, Grant was promoted to brigadier general, backdated to May 17, 1861. Control of the Mississippi River was the key to victory in the Western Theater. Believing Grant was a general of dogged persistence and iron will, Major General John C. Fremont assigned Grant to command troops on the Mississippi at Cairo, Illinois at the end of August, passing over Generals John Pope and Benjamin Prentiss. Fremont dismissed rumors of Grant's drunkenness years earlier in the regular army, saying there was something about Grant's manner that was sufficient to counteract the influence of what they said. Cairo was a bustling Union military and naval base that was to be used to launch a joint campaign down the Mississippi, Tennessee, and Cumberland rivers. After the Confederates moved into western Kentucky, with designs on southern Illinois, Grant, under Fremont's authority, advanced on Paducah, Kentucky, taking it without a fight, and set up a supply station. Having understood the importance to Lincoln in keeping Kentucky in the Union, Grant assured its citizens, "I have come among you not as your enemy, but as your friend." On November 1, Fremont ordered Grant to make demonstrations against the Confederates on both sides of the Mississippi, but prohibited him from attacking the enemy. Belmont, Forts Henry and Donelson. On November 1, 1861, Fremont ordered Grant to embark south with his troops from Cairo to attack Confederate soldiers encamped in Belmont, Missouri. Grant, along with Brigadier General John A. McClernand, landed 2,500 men at Hunter's Point, 2 miles north of the Confederate base outside Belmont. They took the camp, but the reinforced Confederates under Brigadier Generals Frank Sheatham and Gideon J. Pillow forced a chaotic Union retreat. At first, Grant had wanted to destroy Confederate strongholds at both Belmont, Missouri, and Columbus, Kentucky, but Fremont had not given Grant enough troops to do the job. All Grant's men could do was disrupt the Confederates and fight their way back to their Union boats. They escaped back to Cairo under fire from the heavily fortified stronghold at Columbus. A tactical defeat, the battle gave Grant's volunteers confidence and experience. Confederate forces still at Columbus blocked the Union Army's access to the lower Mississippi. Grant, and General James B. McPherson, came up with a plan to bypass Columbus and with a force of 25,000 troops, move against Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and then 10 miles east to Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River, with the aid of gunboats, opening both rivers and allowing the Union access further south. Grant presented his plan to Henry Halleck, his new commander under the newly created Department of Missouri. Halleck was considering the same strategy, but rebuffed Grant, believing he needed twice the number of troops. However, after Halleck telegraphed and consulted McClellan about the plan, he finally agreed on condition that the attack be conducted in close cooperation with Navy flag officer, Andrew H. Foote. After Foote's gunboats had silenced most of the guns at the fort, Grant's troops moved in and easily captured Fort Henry on February 6, 1862. Grant then ordered an immediate assault on nearby Fort Donelson, under the command of John B. Floyd, which dominated the Cumberland River. Unlike Fort Henry, Grant was now going up against a force equal to his. Unaware of the garrison's strength, Grant's forces approached the scene overconfident from their easy victory at Fort Henry. Grant, McClernand, and Smith positioned their divisions around the fort. The next day McClernand and Smith launched probing attacks on what they figured were weak spots in the Confederate line, only to retreat with heavy losses. On February 14, Foote's gunboats arrived and began bombarding the fort, only to be repulsed by the heavy guns at the fort. Foote himself was wounded. Thus far it was a victory for the Confederates, but soon Union reinforcements arrived, giving Grant a total force of over 40,000 men. When Foote regained control of the river, Grant resumed his attack, but a standoff remained. That evening Confederate Commander Floyd called a council of war, unsure of his next action. Grant received a dispatch from Foote, requesting that they meet. Grant mounted a horse and rode 7 miles over freezing roads and trenches, reaching Smith's division, instructing him to prepare for the next assault, and rode on and met up with McClernand and Wallace. After exchanging reports he met up with Foote. After they conferred, Foote resumed his bombardment, which signaled the other generals to resume the attack. After a day of battle, Fort Donelson submitted to Grant's demand for unconditional and immediate surrender, and Floyd struck his flag. Grant telegraphed Halleck, informing him that Fort Donelson had fallen. Grant had won the first major victory for the Union, capturing Floyd's entire rebel army of more than 12,000. Halleck was nevertheless angry that Grant had acted without his authorization and complained to McClellan, accusing Grant of neglect and inefficiency. On March 3, Halleck sent a telegram to Washington complaining that he had no communication with Grant for a week. 3 days later, Halleck followed up with a postscript claiming word has just reached me that Grant has resumed his bad habits of drinking. Lincoln, regardless, promoted Grant to Major General of Volunteers while the Northern press treated Grant as a hero. Playing off his initials, they took to calling him Unconditional Surrender Grant. Shiloh and aftermath. As the great numbers of troops from both armies gathered, it was widely assumed in the North that this would be the battle to end the war. Grant, reinstated by Halleck at Lincoln's and Stanton's urging, left Fort Henry and traveled by boat up the Tennessee River to rejoin his army with orders to advance with the Army of the Tennessee into Tennessee. Grant's main Union army was located at Pittsburgh Landing, while 40,000 Confederate troops converged at Corinth. Brigadier General William Tecumseh Sherman assured Grant that his Green troops were ready for an attack. Grant agreed and wired Halleck with their assessment. Grant, whose forces numbered 45,000, wanted to attack the Confederates at Corinth, but Halleck ordered him not to attack until Major General Don Carlos Buell arrived with his division of 25,000. Meanwhile, Grant prepared for an attack on the Confederate army of roughly equal strength. Instead of preparing defensive fortifications between the Tennessee River and Owl Creek, and clearing fields of fire, they spent most of their time drilling the largely inexperienced troops while Sherman dismissed reports of nearby Confederates. Union inaction created the opportunity for the Confederates to attack first before Buell arrived. On the morning of April 6, 1862, Grant's troops were taken by surprise when the Confederates, led by Generals Albert Sidney Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard, struck first like an alpine avalanche near Shiloh Church, attacking 5 divisions of Grant's army and forcing a confused retreat toward the Tennessee River. Johnston was wounded and died during the engagement, and command fell upon Beauregard. One Union line held the Confederate attack off for several hours at a place later called the Hornet's Nest, giving Grant time to assemble artillery and 20,000 troops near Pittsburgh Landing. The Confederates finally broke through the Hornet's Nest to capture a Union division, but Grant's last line held Pittsburgh Landing, while the exhausted Confederates, lacking reinforcements, halted their advance. That evening, heavy rain set in while Grant and his staff took cover and huddled around a fire. When asked by McPherson if he was going to retreat, Grant replied, "Retreat? No, I propose to attack them at daylight and whip them." Bolstered by 18,000 fresh troops from the divisions of Major Generals Buell and Lew Wallace, Grant counterattacked at dawn the next day and regained the field, forcing the disorganized and demoralized rebels to retreat back to Corinth while thousands deserted. Halleck ordered Grant not to advance more than 1 day from Pittsburgh Landing, stopping the pursuit of the Confederate army. Although Grant had won the battle, the situation was little changed, with the Union in possession of Pittsburgh Landing and the Confederates once again holed up in Corinth. Grant, now realizing that the South was determined to fight and that the war would not be won with one battle, would later write, "Then, indeed, I gave up all idea of saving the postmasters across the nation." After the Klan's decline, a faction of Southern conservatives called Redeemers formed armed groups, such as the Red Shirts and the White League, who openly used violence and intimidation in an attempt to take control of state governments. The Panic of 1873 and the ensuing Depression contributed to public fatigue, and the North grew less concerned with Reconstruction. Supreme Court rulings in the Slaughterhouse cases and United States v. Cruikshank restricted federal enforcement of civil rights. Grant began to limit the use of troops to avoid the impression that he was acting as a military dictator. In 1874, Grant ended the Brooks-Baxter War, bringing Reconstruction in Arkansas to a peaceful conclusion. That same year, he sent troops and warships under Major General William H. Emory to New Orleans in the wake of the Colfax Massacre and disputes over the election of Governor William Pitt Kellogg. Emory restored Kellogg to office, and the following year the parties reached a compromise allowing Democrats to retain control of the Louisiana House. Grant recalled Sheridan and most of the federal troops from Louisiana. By 1875, Redeemer Democrats took control of all but 3 Southern states. As violence against black Southerners escalated once more, Attorney General Edwards Pierpont told Governor Adelbert Ames of Mississippi that the people were tired of the autumnal outbreaks in the South, and declined to intervene directly, instead, sending an emissary to negotiate a peaceful election. Grant later regretted not issuing a proclamation to help Ames, having been told Republicans in Ohio would bolt the party if Grant intervened in Mississippi. Grant told Congress in January 1875 he could not see with indifference Union men or Republicans ostracized, persecuted, and murdered. Congress refused to strengthen the laws against violence, but instead passed a sweeping law to guarantee blacks access to public facilities. Grant signed it as the Civil Rights Act of 1875, but enforcement was weak and the Supreme Court ruled the law unconstitutional in 1883. In October 1876, Grant dispatched troops to South Carolina to aid Republican Governor Daniel Henry Chamberlain. Grant's successor, Hayes, abandoned the remaining 3 Republican governments in the South that were supported by the Army after the Compromise of 1877, which marked the end of Reconstruction. Indian peace policy. When Grant took office in 1869, the nation's policy towards Indians was in chaos, with more than 250,000 Indians being governed by 370 treaties. Grant promised in his inaugural address to work toward the proper treatment of the original occupants of this land, the Indians. He appointed Ely S. Parker, a Seneca Indian, a member of his wartime staff, as Commissioner of Indian Affairs, the first Native American to serve in this position. With his familiarity of Indian life, Parker became the chief architect of Grant's peace policy. In April 1869, Grant signed a law establishing a Board of Indian Commissioners to oversee spending and reduce corruption in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. In 1871, he signed a bill ending the Indian treaty system. The law now treated individual Native Americans as wards of the federal government, and no longer dealt with the tribes as sovereign entities. Grant believed that Indians, given opportunities for education and work, could serve alongside white men. His peace policy aimed to replace entrepreneurs serving as Indian agents with missionaries and aimed to protect Indians on reservations and educate them in farming. "My efforts in the future will be directed," Grant said in his second inaugural address, "by a humane course, to bring the aborigines of the country under the benign influences of education and civilization. Wars of extermination are demoralizing and wicked." Grant's policy had greater success in the Southwest. General Oliver Otis Howard negotiated peace with the Apache in 1872, convincing their leader, Cochise, to move the tribe to a new reservation, and ending a war started the year before. In Oregon, relations were less peaceful, as war with the Modocs erupted in April 1873. The Modocs refused to move to a reservation and killed the local army commander, Major General Edward Canby. Grant ordered restraint after Canby's death, disregarding Sherman's advice to seek revenge or exterminate the tribe. The army captured, tried, and executed the 4 Modoc warriors responsible for Canby's murder, and Grant ordered the rest of the Modoc tribe relocated to the Indian Territory. In 1874, the army defeated the Comanche Indians at the Battle of Palo Duro Canyon. Their villages were burned and horses slaughtered, eventually forcing them to finally settle at the Fort Sill Reservation in 1875. Grant pocket vetoed a bill in 1874 protecting bison and supporting Interior Secretary Columbus Delano, who believed the killing of bison would force Plains Indians to abandon their nomadic lifestyle. The Plains tribes accepted the reservation system, but encounters with prospectors and settlers in search of gold in the Black Hills led to renewed conflict in the Great Sioux War of 1876, ending the understanding that had developed between Grant and Sioux chief Red Cloud. Grant was determined to enforce the treaty using the army if necessary, but after summoning Sheridan to Washington he was reminded that the post-Civil War army was undermanned and spread thinly and that the territory involved was vast, requiring great numbers of soldiers to enforce the treaty. As a result, it was never enforced. During the war, Sioux warriors led by Crazy Horse killed George Armstrong Custer and his men at the Battle of the Little Big Horn, the Army's most famous defeat in the Indian Wars. Later, Grant castigated Custer in the press, saying, "I regard Custer's massacre as a sacrifice of troops, brought on by Custer himself, that was wholly unnecessary, wholly unnecessary." In spite of Grant's efforts, over 200 battles were fought with the Indians during his presidency. The policy was considered humanitarian for its time but was later criticized for disregarded native cultures. Foreign affairs. The most pressing foreign policy concerns when Grant took office were resolving the Alabama claims against Great Britain and whether to recognize Cuban belligerency. The dispute with the United Kingdom stemmed from a complex of grievances centering on attacks on American shipping during the Civil War by the CSS Alabama, a Confederate warship constructed in England. Senator Charles Sumner, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, believed the British had violated American neutrality and demanded reparations. Sumner convinced his fellow senators to reject the Johnson administration's proposed settlement, believing that Britain should directly pay $2 billion in gold or, alternatively, cede Canada to the United States. Fish and Boutwell convinced Grant that peaceful relations with Britain were more important than acquisition of territory, and the two nations agreed to negotiate along those lines. To avoid jeopardizing negotiations, Grant refrained from recognizing Cuban rebels who were fighting for independence from Spain, which would have been inconsistent with American objections to the British granting belligerent status to Confederates. A commission in Washington produced a treaty whereby an international tribunal would settle the damage amounts. The British admitted regret, but not fault. The Senate approved the Treaty of Washington, which also settled disputes over fishing rights and maritime boundaries, by a 50-12 vote in 1871. Grant's success with Britain was undermined by his attempt to annex the Dominican Republic, an independent nation unable to pay its debt. Many Americans believed a Caribbean naval base would establish naval dominance and be useful in protecting shipping from piracy in a potential Isthmian canal. Anti-imperialist Republicans had previously rejected a Johnson administration treaty to establish a Samama Bay naval base. Grant took interest in Dominican annexation and sent his secretary, Orville E. Babcock, there to consult with Buenaventura Baez, the pro-annexation Dominican president. Babcock returned in September 1869 with a draft treaty of annexation, although Fish had not given him any diplomatic authority. Given such authority by Fish, Babcock visited the island nation a second time, making a treaty for Dominican annexation and the lease of Samama Bay. The cabinet discussed the treaties at a meeting on December 21. Fish dismissed annexation, seeing the island as politically unstable. Grant supported it, believing acquisition of the majority black nation would increase commerce, create a refuge for African Americans, and help to exploit the island's natural resources. He lobbied Sumner in hopes of influencing him to help with passage of the treaties. Fish added to the effort out of loyalty to Grant, but to no avail. Sumner was set against annexation, and on June 30, 1870, the Senate rejected the treaties. A congressional investigation headed by Senator Carl Schurz revealed speculators had promoted the treaty's passage. Unwilling to admit defeat, Grant convinced Congress to send a commission to investigate. Although the commission approved Grant's call for annexation in its findings, the Senate remained opposed and Grant was forced to abandon further efforts. Grant retaliated by firing Sumner's friend and minister to Great Britain, John Lothrop Motley, while he pressured the Senate to depose Sumner of his chairmanship. In October 1873, Grant's neutrality policy was shaken, when a Spanish cruiser captured a merchant ship, Virginius, flying the U.S. flag, carrying war materials and men to aid the Cuban insurrection. Spanish authorities executed the prisoners, including 8 American citizens, and many Americans called for war with Spain. Grant ordered the Navy to increase its presence in the Caribbean. Fish, with Grant's support, worked to reach a peaceful resolution. Spain's president, Emilio Castilla y Ripoll, expressed regret for the tragedy, surrendered the Virginius and paid a cash indemnity of $80,000 to the families of the executed Americans. Realizing the Navy was susceptible to European naval powers, in June 1874, Secretary Robeson commissioned the reconstruction of 5 redesigned double-turreted monitor warships. The administration's diplomacy was also at work in the Pacific. In December 1874, Grant held a state dinner at the White House for the King of Hawaii, David Kalakaua, who was seeking duty-free sugar importation to the U.S. Grant and Fish secured a free trade treaty in 1875 with the Kingdom of Hawaii, incorporating the Pacific Islands sugar industry into the United States economic sphere. Gold Standard and the Gold Ring. Soon after taking office, Grant took conservative steps to return the nation's currency to a more secure footing. During the Civil War, Congress had authorized the Treasury to issue banknotes that, unlike the rest of the currency, were not backed by gold or silver. The greenback notes, as they were known, were necessary to pay the unprecedented war debts, but they also caused inflation and forced gold-backed money out of circulation. Grant determined to return the national economy to pre-war monetary standards. On March 18, 1869, Grant signed the Public Credit Act of 1869 that guaranteed bondholders would be repaid in coin or its equivalent, while greenbacks would gradually be redeemed by the Treasury and replaced by notes backed by specie. The act committed the government to full return of the gold standard within 10 years. This followed a policy of hard currency economy and gradual reduction of the national debt. Grant's own ideas about the economy were simple, and he relied on the advice of wealthy and financially successful businessmen that he courted. In the spring of 1869, understanding Grant's attraction to the wealthy, Jay Gould, a Wall Street trader and railroad magnate, and financier Jim Fisk, seeking to drive up the price of gold, plotted a scheme to entrap Grant for their own profit, telling Grant that a high gold price would help farmers. To promote this selfing theory, Gould found a willing conduit, speculator Abel Corbin, Grant's brother-in-law, who used his connection with the president to get inside information. The collaborators were later known as the Gold Ring. Corbin and Gould lobbied for and convinced Grant to appoint Gould's associate, Daniel Butterfield, as assistant treasurer, allowing Butterfield to gather information for the ring. After consulting in early September with Alexander Stewart, his erstwhile nominee for Treasury Secretary, Grant stopped the sale of gold, naively accepting that it would alleviate Western farmers' troubles. By mid-September, seeing that the rapid gold price increase was unnatural, Grant warned Boutwell to be on his guard against the bears and bulls, while the conspirators bought ever more gold and the rising price affected the wider economy. While Grant was spending leisure time in southwest Pennsylvania, he received a letter, by private courier, from Corbin on September 18, urging Grant to curb government gold sales. Suspicious, Grant finally realized what Gould and Fisk were up to, and he became determined to break the gold ring. Returning to Washington, Grant told Boutwell to sell gold, which would reduce its price and strengthen the dollar. Boutwell did so the next day, on September 24, 1869, later known as Black Friday. Gold prices plummeted, Gould and Fisk fled for their own safety, while economic damages were extensive months afterwards. By January 1870, the economy resumed its post-war recovery. Gould and Fisk managed to escape without much harm to themselves. A congressional investigation followed, chaired by James A. Garfield, and cleared Grant of profiteering, but excoriated Gould and Fisk for their manipulation of the gold market and Corbin for exploiting his personal connection to Grant. Election of 1872 and second term. Despite his administration's scandals, Grant continued to be personally popular. His re-election was supported by Frederick Douglass and other prominent abolitionists, along with reformers of the Indian question. In 1871, to placate reformers and alleviate a burgeoning federal bureaucracy, Grant created the Civil Service Commission, chaired by reformer George William Curtis, authorized and funded by Congress, to take effect January 1, 1872. Congress, however, failed to enact permanent civil service legislation, and in 1875 it refused to implement funding to maintain the commission. Party reformers cooled toward Grant, critical of Grant's implementation of the commission's proposed reforms, corruption at the New York Customs House investigated by Congress, and Grant's alliance with party and patronage boss New York Senator Roscoe Conkling. There was further party division between the faction most concerned with the plight of the freedmen, and the faction concerned with the growth of industry and small government. During the war, both factions' interests had aligned, and in 1868 both had supported Grant. As the wartime coalition began to fray, Grant's alignment with the party's pro-Reconstruction elements alienated party leaders who favored an end to federal intervention in Southern racial issues. In March 1871, led by Senator Carl Schurz of Missouri and Jacob D. Cox, Grant's former Secretary of Interior, 100 Republicans in Cincinnati broke from the party and formed what became the Liberal Republican Party, supporting civil service reform, sound money, low tariffs, and states' rights. The Liberals denounced granteism, corruption, nepotism, and inefficiency, demanded the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, literary tests for blacks to vote, and amnesty for Confederates. The Liberals nominated Horace Greeley, a leading Republican New York Tribune editor and a fierce enemy of Grant, for president, and Missouri Governor B. Gratz Brown, for vice president. The Democrats adopted the Greeley-Brown ticket and the Liberals' party platform. The opposition pushed the themes that Grant was a scandal-ridden crook and a drunkard. The regular Republican Party nominated Grant for re-election, with Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts replacing Colfax as the vice presidential nominee. Details revealed of the Credit Mobilier bribery scandal, implicating both Colfax and Wilson, stung the Grant administration, but did not directly involve Grant. The Republicans shrewdly borrowed from the Liberals' party platform, including extended amnesty, lowered tariffs, and embraced civil service reform. To placate the burgeoning suffragist movement, the Republicans' platform included that women's rights should be treated with respectful consideration, while Grant advocated equal rights for all citizens. To the Liberals' chagrin, Greeley made Grant's Southern policy, rather than reform, the main campaign issue. Grant won re-election easily, as federal prosecution of the Klan, a strong economy, debt reduction, lowered tariffs, and tax reductions, helped Grant defeat Greeley. Grant received 3.6 million, 55.6%, votes to Greeley's 2.8 million votes and an electoral college landslide of 286 to 66. A majority of African Americans in the South voted for Grant, while Democratic opposition remained mostly peaceful. Grant lost in 6 former slave states that wanted to see an end to Reconstruction. Grant proclaimed the victory as a personal vindication of his presidency, but inwardly he felt betrayed by the Liberals. Grant was sworn in for his second term by Salmon P. Chase on March 4, 1873. In his second inaugural address, he reiterated the problems still facing the nation and focused on what he considered the chief issues of the day: freedom and fairness for all Americans, while emphasizing the benefits of citizenship for freed slaves. Grant concluded his address with the words, "My efforts in the future will be directed towards the restoration of good feelings between the different sections of our common community." In 1873, Wilson suffered a stroke, never fully recovering. He died in office on November 22, 1875. With Wilson's loss, Grant relied on Fish's guidance more than ever. Panic of 1873 and loss of Congress. Grant continued to work for a strong dollar, signing into law the Coinage Act of 1873, which effectively ended the legal basis for bimetallism, the use of both silver and gold as money, establishing the gold standard in practice. The Coinage Act discontinued the standard silver dollar and established the gold dollar as the sole monetary standard. Because the gold supply did not increase as quickly as the population, the result was deflation. Silverites who wanted more money in circulation to raise prices farmers received denounced the move as the crime of 1873, claiming the deflation made debts more burdensome for farmers. Grant's second term saw renewed economic turmoil. In September 1873, J. Cook & Company, a New York brokerage house, collapsed after it failed to sell all of the bonds issued by J. Cook's Northern Pacific Railway. The collapse rippled through Wall Street, and other banks and brokerages that owned railroad stocks and bonds were also ruined. On September 20, the New York Stock Exchange suspended trading for 10 days. Grant, who knew little about finance, traveled to New York to consult leading businessmen and bankers for advice on how to resolve the crisis, which became known as the Panic of 1873. Grant believed that, as with the collapse of the gold ring in 1869, the panic was merely an economic fluctuation that affected bankers and brokers. He instructed the Treasury to buy $10 million in government bonds, injecting cash into the system. The purchases curbed the panic on Wall Street, but an industrial depression, later called the Long Depression, nonetheless swept the nation. Many of the nation's railroads, 89 out of 364, went bankrupt. Congress hoped inflation would stimulate the economy and passed what became known as the Inflation Bill in 1874. Many farmers and workingmen favored the bill, which would have added $64 million in greenbacks to circulation, but some Eastern bankers opposed it because it would have weakened the dollar. Belknap, Williams, and Delano told Grant a veto would hurt Republicans in the November elections. Grant believed the bill would destroy the credit of the nation, and he vetoed it despite their objections. Grant's veto placed him in the conservative faction of the Republican Party and was the beginning of the party's commitment to a strong gold-backed dollar. Grant later pressured Congress for a bill to further strengthen the dollar by gradually reducing the number of greenbacks in circulation. When the Democrats gained a majority in the House after the 1874 elections, the lame duck Republican Congress did so before the Democrats took office. On January 14, 1875, Grant signed the Specie Payment Resumption Act into law, which required gradual reduction of the number of greenbacks allowed to circulate and declared that specie payment, i.e., in gold or silver, would resume in 1879. Gilded Age corruption and reform. Grant was president during the Gilded Age, a time of massive industrial growth, railroad speculation, and extravagance that fueled unethical behavior in government offices. Although Grant was not personally involved in scandal, corruption charges plagued his administration. Grant trusted of men involved in speculation, particularly wealthy Gilded Age tycoons, loyally defending his corrupt cabinet or appointees whom he believed innocent. He persistently failed to make suitable appointments, often selecting friends and family members. Grant, however, did not stop the guilty party's prosecutions, while his political enemies used the scandals as an excuse to discredit Reconstruction. No person linked any of the scandals together, except possibly Grant's personal secretary, Orville E. Babcock, who indirectly controlled many cabinet departments and delayed federal investigations. Historians debate how effective he was at halting corruption. In November 1871, Grant appointed New York collector Thomas Murphy, an ally of Roscoe Conkling, resigned from office. Murphy's men had created a corrupt profiteering ring at the New York Custom House. Grant appointed Chester A. Arthur, another Conkling man, to replace Murphy, and administration of the Customs House steadily improved. Pressured by an 1872 congressional investigation, Grant ordered prosecutions of men involved in the bribery scandal at the Customs House and removed the ringleader. Grant was exonerated, but his own reputation was damaged by being associated with Conkling's patronage machine. On March 3, 1873, Grant signed a bill that increased pay for federal employees, including a congressional pay hike that was retroactive to the start of the Congress. Decried as the Salary Grab Act, Congress repealed the law later that year, but Grant was allowed to keep his doubled $50,000 a year salary. Scandals escalated in Grant's second term, reaching into the president's inner circle. In 1874, a congressional investigation exposed corruption in the Treasury Department, known as the Sanborn Incident. Previously, acting Treasury Secretary William Adams Richardson, hired John B. Sanborn as an independent tax collector on a 50% commission basis, known as a moiety. Richardson became Secretary of Treasury in March 1873. Sanborn was given virtual control of the Treasury, and he used excessive intrusive methods of obtaining taxes. By falsely accusing companies of tax evasion, he was able to extort large sums of money from them. An 1874 congressional investigation exposed Sanborn's malicious profiteering and condemned Richardson for allowing Sanborn to abuse the law but did not attempt impeachment. Richardson resigned when the House motioned his censure and Grant appointed him as a judge of the Court of Claims. In June 1874, Grant signed the Anti-Moiety Act, abolishing that system. Grant replaced Richardson as Treasury Secretary with Benjamin H. Bristow, a man known for his honesty, who began a series of reforms in the department, while tightening up its investigation force. Since the Civil War, taxes on whiskey accounted for almost half of the government's revenue, but to avoid paying steep taxes, whiskey distillers and corrupt Treasury agents falsified figures on the amount of liquor produced, while certifying bogus returns. Bristow's investigators uncovered a national whiskey ring that was denying the Treasury millions in revenue. Much of this money was being pocketed while some of it went into Republican coffers. Informed by Bristow, Grant authorized him to let no guilty man escape, and in May 1875, Bristow struck at the ring. Federal marshals seized 32 installations and arrested 350 men. 176 indictments were obtained, leading to 110 convictions and $3,150,000 in fines returned to the Treasury. Bristow's probings revealed Grant's secretary Babcock warned chief culprits in St. Louis, including John McDonald, the ringleader mastermind, of the coming investigations, who were rewarded with $1,000 bills and cigar boxes from the ring. At this point, an outraged Grant was ready to travel to St. Louis to testify in Babcock's favor, but Secretary Fish warned that doing so would put Grant in the embarrassing position of testifying against a case prosecuted by his own administration. On February 12, Grant remained in Washington and gave a deposition in Babcock's defense, that expressed his unshaken confidence in his secretary. Grant's testimony silenced all but his most strongest critics. The trial jury acquitted Babcock, but there was enough evidence revealed that Grant reluctantly dismissed him from the White House. Grant freed some ring members after a few months in prison, including McDonald, released after serving 17 months of a 3-year sentence, while he unfairly blamed Bristow, who later resigned, for Babcock's prosecution. When the Democrats took control of the House in 1875, they launched a series of investigations into corruption in federal departments. Among the most damaging of the scandals involved Secretary of War William W. Belknap taking quarterly kickbacks from the Fort Sill tradership, which led to his resignation in February 1876. Belknap was impeached and tried by the Senate that summer, but was not convicted. Congress also investigated and reprimanded Navy Secretary Robeson in July 1876 for bribery. Grant had limited success in civil service reform and his Civil Service Commission, CSC. Grant appointed Secretary of Interior Cox strongly promoted reform, implemented a merit system, and rebuffed mandatory party contributions. Head of the CSC, George Curtis, recommended drastic measures, advocating examinations and the end of forced political payments. Grant's implemented civil service reforms, however, were more honored in the breach than the observance. The Interior Department under Secretary Delano, Grant's appointment who replaced Cox, was rife with fraud and corrupt agents, and Delano was forced to resign. Grant's Secretary Interior Chandler, who succeeded Delano in 1875, cleaned up corruption and reformed the interior. When Grant was informed by Postmaster Jewell of a potential congressional investigation into an extortion scandal involving Attorney General Williams' wife, Grant fired Williams and appointed Edwards Pierpont in his place. Grant's appointments of Bristow, Pierpont, and Jewell on his cabinet temporarily appeased reformers. Grant suggested other reforms as well, including a proposal that states should offer free public schooling to all children. He also endorsed the Blaine Amendment, which would have forbidden government aid to schools with religious affiliations. In November 1876, Grant apologized to the nation and admitted mistakes in his administration, saying, "Failures have been errors of judgment, not of intent." Election of 1876. Even as Grant drew cheers at the opening of the Centennial Exposition in May 1876, the collected scandals of his presidency, the country's weak economy, and the Democratic gains in the House led many in the Republican Party to repudiate him in June. Bristow was among the leading candidates to replace him, suggesting that a large faction desired an end to Grantism and feared that Grant would run for a third term. Ultimately, Grant declined to run, but Bristow also failed to capture the nomination, as the convention settled on Governor Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio, a reformer. The Democrats nominated Governor Samuel J. Tilden of New York. Voting irregularities in 3 southern states caused the election that year to remain undecided for several months. Grant told Congress to settle the matter through legislation and assured both sides that he would not use the army to force a result, except to curb violence. On January 29, 1877, he signed legislation forming an electoral commission to decide the matter. The commission ruled that the disputed votes belonged to Hayes. To forestall Democratic protests, Republicans agreed to the Compromise of 1877, in which the last troops were withdrawn from Southern capitals. The Republicans had won, but Reconstruction was over. According to biographer Jean Edward Smith, Grant's calm visage in the White House reassured the nation. Post-presidency. World tour and diplomacy. After leaving the White House, Grant and his family stayed with Fish in Washington for 2 months before setting out on a world tour that lasted approximately 2.5 years. Preparing for the tour, they arrived in Philadelphia on May 10, 1877, and were honored with celebrations during the week before their departure. On May 16, Grant and Julia.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.